Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday edition. I'm Stacy Smith. Like many other religious denominations, the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh has seen a drop in attendance at its worship services. Combined with an aging population, there seems to be fewer and fewer people attending Mass. Well, this weekend, Bishop David Zubik is releasing details of major changes in parish groupings within the diocese. The decisions could mean the transfer of priests from one parish to another. So how will these changes affect worshipers and the clergy? And what factors affected the decision? This morning on the KDPG Sunday edition, Bishop David Zubik is our special guest to talk about the challenges the Catholic Church of the Diocese of Pittsburgh faces and organized religion as a whole. David Sherman, the executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, is also with us for this morning's discussion. Bishop Zubik, thank you so much for joining us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. I know this is a momentous weekend for the Pittsburgh Catholic Diocese. This has been in the works for some time. You created your Church Alive, your mission, and you've been working on this for some time. Today is, and yesterday at 4 o'clock masses throughout the diocese, 6 o'clock masses, your letter was read. Basically, what are you doing? You're closing parishes right now or not?
No, not right now. No, I think what we're trying to do is build life within each of the parishes. And I want to situate it to go back to 11 years when I came back, 11 years ago when I came back to Pittsburgh. Our priest said, Bishop, you got to do something about what happens in our churches. We're losing people left and right. We've got to look for ways in which the church can be alive. And, you know, many will remember at my homily, at my installation, I said, are you excited about our faith? What can we really do to make sure that everybody gets excited about their faith? And so this weekend is an opportunity, I think, for people to reassess where they are and how we really need to come together as faith communities to help each other ultimately get to heaven.
All right, I want to get into the whys and the wherefores of perhaps declining church attendance, and it's not only the Catholic Church, but other religions as well. But I want to get into some of the specifics of the changes that you are making. First of all, how many parishes are there in the 6 months? We have 188
parishes.
And how many will there be after this weekend?
We have, well, no, after this weekend there'll be 188 parishes. Because one of the main misconceptions that a lot of people have is that somehow when we're announcing the 57 groupings that the other parishes go out of existence, and that is not true. You know, as a matter of fact, what will happen, the first thing that has to happen when the clergy teams come on board with the parishes that are in groupings in October, the first challenge that they face is how do we bring all of the parishes within a particular grouping together. Groupings will be from as small as 2 parishes to as large as 7. And the challenge, the only challenge, the first challenge that people have to face is how do we come together? And then over the course of either 2, 3, or 5 years, those groupings will have the opportunity to be able to see how can they come together to be a good faith community. During the course of that time, they will offer to me suggestions. First of all, when they feel it's time to come together as a new parish. Number 2, I'm asking them to afford me at that time the names, 3 names that they would like to see the new parish have. And then third of all, they will make the suggestion of how many buildings they're going to need to supply the needs of the faithful in that grouping.
So you are actually in some ways devolving power down to the parish level.
Exactly, and through this whole process. When we formally began
it, church federalism in a way.
Well, I think where we started in April 12th of 2015. From there, I've asked people to have as much input as possible. And you know, when we took what were known as the original models, we had over 30,000 people across our 188 parishes who came together to offer their insights. And I listened carefully to what they had to say, as well as the input that was given by both our priests and our deacons.
All right, so you have 188 parishes now, and you're going to go into groupings. I presume the groupings a lot of times are based on geographical?
All of them will be based on geography, correct.
Okay. What's the largest mileage differentiation among?
Well, I think that's already one that's already been formed, and that's when we get down to the southern part of Washington County or Greene County, because in that particular area you have parishes that were pretty distant from each other. But they've already worked together to bring themselves together in the process, and they become one of the models, as a matter of fact, of what can happen to all the other parishes as well, too.
how has the attendance been with that consolidation? I'm going to call it consolidation of the parishes there.
I think they've remained steady and maybe even had a little bit of an increase. I think at first, you know, there was some resistance about why can't I have my parish as it was? But I think as people begin to see what it means to come together, they can see that a lot more can happen. There's more excitement in terms of both worship as well as in activity. And if there's one area that I could really point to, it would be what we call South Pittsburgh. You know, about 5 years ago, 4 parishes, St. Albert the Great, St. Basil, St. Wendelin, and St. Norbert's, they realized that they were going to have to do something because of not only the dwindling population in the church, but the dwindling population in those neighborhoods. They were resisting at first. They came together. They came to me in 2016 and said, "We're ready to become a parish. Will you form us as a new parish?" I did. It's called Holy Apostles. And if you go there now, you see so much life. The second Saturday of every month, they have what's called a Festival of Praise. The church is packed. And I have to say, in many ways, the church is packed with people who wouldn't normally come to Mass or haven't been coming to Mass. And that's part of what we're trying to do with all of this, to get the people who are involved in church excited about their faith, and to draw people back in who have not been in church, or people who are curious about what we have to offer to come and see what the Catholic Church is about.
I want to get back into some of the particulars here. Down the road, you say in 2, 3, 5 years.
Right.
So you have a parish grouping as such.
Right.
Will it, in the end, be just one church building?
Well, that's all going to depend on each of the groupings. And I think they'll be the ones to come back and recommend how many church buildings are needed in that area. No one of these groupings am I looking for a cookie cutter approach.
Okay.
Because the personality of each of these areas, even if they're neighboring to each other, they have to come together to come back and tell me what works.
All right, so as it stands right now, the way it's going to go from this point forward, I guess it really takes place in October. Is that right?
That's October 15th is when when all the assignments begin, and that's when the groupings take effect.
That's when the groupings start to take effect. So if you have, let's say you've combined 3 parishes and 3 different churches there, the priests then you're going to start making decisions as to which masses are going to be held in each church building at that point? That
will happen during the course of the summer, even before October comes. Because what has to happen, one of the things that we're following here is that the number of masses in a particular grouping is going to be determined by the number of priests, and that each priest will be able to celebrate 3 masses on a given weekend. So if you have 3 priests assigned to a grouping, that means there'll be 9 masses in all of those parishes that are a part of that grouping. Over the course of the summer, the people will be a part of having to decide not only where those masses will be, but those schedules will be announced sometime in August.
Bishop, will some buildings be closed as a result of this?
Not immediately. That's part of what I'm saying, that over the course of that 2, 3, or 5 years, that's where the faith community will come back and say, here are the number of buildings that we need, or the number of buildings that we can afford.
And which ones we need.
That's exactly right. That they'll be coming back to offer that recommendation to me.
So there is a possibility that if I'm accustomed to going to St. David Church and attending Mass at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, there may not be a 9 o'clock Sunday morning Mass at that particular church. It might be moved to 11 o'clock.
Right. It might change. That's correct.
Okay, so that's
and that will be announced in each of those groupings in August.
Now the next thing that's going to be taking place, and it's the one I think is going to perhaps create some of the biggest problems for you as far as angry phone calls, is that you're going to be moving some priests around as well.
There are, and I think what I hope our people are going to understand is that the diocese is bigger than a person's particular parish. And that what we really have tried to do in the assignment, I've tried to do in the assignment of priests, is to listen to them. All of our priests had a number of opportunities last year to be able to fill out a very intensive survey in which they speak to what are their gifts, Where might they like to be assigned in terms of 3 possible options? They had an interview with our personnel board. I met with all of our men last summer, and so what I tried to do with the assistance of the personnel board, clergy personnel board, the deacon personnel board, as well as with the vicars in each of our 4 regions of the diocese, is to take a look at what are the needs of a faith community of the people in this particular area, and which of our priests can meet the personality and the needs of those folks. And so I can honestly say, and we met with all of our priests on Thursday to be able to give the new assignments, I think that by and large our priests recognized that I followed along with what they had to say, but I think they could see the wisdom if I was asking them to go in a particular area. It was because they have a gift, a talent that can bring life to the particular set of parishes they're going to be assigned to.
Did you have any resistance from the priests?
Well, not so much resistance as people would say, Bishop, I'm not sure that that's exactly going to be the best place to go. And then I listened to them carefully, and quite honestly, because there was some input from those people. I changed where they were initially going to be going to someplace else.
So you were involved yourself personally in these decisions?
Myself and a whole team. I have a terrific team of people who've been working with
me. But you were there?
I did, yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. We're going to have to take a break, but I want to ask this question. The changes that are coming within the church, is it because of the declining population, or the declining number of priests, or the combination?
Or declining finances?
But I mean, the primary reason for it is to get people excited about their faith. Now that those other factors come in, I can't deny that. Declining numbers of people in some areas. We have other areas of the diocese where there's a population explosion that is even infusing more people into the churches. For example, Cranberry, Adams Township, those places, and there are other sites of the diocese. Second of all, we have to be concerned about the number of priests, because what really makes us the Catholic Church is people coming together to celebrate Mass. In order to have Mass, you have to have enough priests to be able to do that. And then I think the other issue that we do have to be concerned about is being able to keep our parishes to be operating. But I see those as secondary factors, important as they are, to the main reason, which is really to get people excited about their faith.
All right, we will continue our discussion with Bishop David Zubik on the KDPG Sunday edition in just a moment.